Hi everyone, I'm Sara Harrison, a PhD student at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research based in Massey University in Wellington, New Zealand. It's almost 4 a.m. here, so please bear with me if I'm a little bit slow in gathering my thoughts. So as Brian said, I'm going to walk you through some of my PhD research, which is broadly on developing an integrated impact, vulnerability, and exposure knowledge base for New Zealand. Brian, you said that you can actually come up with catchy titles, but you came up with this title, which I really loved, so I kept it. So I'm not going to spend too much time describing what impact-based forecasts and warnings are, because I think Brian and Isabel gave a pretty good background of it. But just to give you an example, this is from the WMO guidelines of an example of an impact warning. So extensive traffic delays in Kensington may occur due to the risk of large trees downing power lines and blocking roads as a result of severe thunderstorms. So there's a lot to unpack in this example. It gives some pretty specific location information and specific impact information. So in Kensington, it may occur, risk of large trees downing power lines, and then that's the result of this hazard, which is severe thunderstorms. Here's an example of an impact forecast or impact-based forecast from Ontario, which is where I'm from. I'm from Barrie, Ontario, originally in Canada. So this is from actually winter last year, almost a year ago, of snow day bus cancellation outlook. So this is produced by Instant Weather, which is an unofficial weather forecasting organization. But I really like this map because it really shows you what they calculated the chances of bus cancellations were as a result of an ice or a snowstorm. And this helped parents prepare if they needed to take time off work the next day because their kids couldn't go to school, or they needed to plan other ways to get their kids to school or to get childcare. So that's kind of a real life example. But what I've found in the literature and from talking to meteorologists and also civil defense practitioners is that there's a lot of data that's needed to support impact-based forecasts and warnings. First, we need the hazard data. Then we need exposure and vulnerability data, which Isabel described really, really well, and impact data. And a lot of the challenges are how to get all of this data, where to find it, and how to bring it all together to support a warning system. Basically how to operationalize it. So I'm trying to tackle this really big question and this really big challenge. So first, I identified in the literature there's actually a lot of groups, people, organizations that hold this data. So we have insurance companies that might have impact data. We have governments that might have exposure or vulnerability data in the form of census. We have the public who also share and have impact data that they might post online on social media. We also have the media. And so there's, a whole bunch of sources. So how can we access it? Can we access it? Is it possible? And how can we use it? Is it usable? So my questions for my PhD research are, how is impact, exposure, and vulnerability data currently collected, stored, and shared in New Zealand? And how can this impact data support an impact-based forecasting and warning system for New Zealand? I'm taking a grounded theory methodology approach. I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but it's basically an inductive methodology that's used in social science research typically to develop ideas and theories from observations and interviews. And so I've been interviewing officials from meteorological services, both within New Zealand and outside of New Zealand, as well as civil defense and emergency management officials from within New Zealand. And I've had about 27 interviews so far, and I'm in the process of running workshops to go in more depth with civil defense groups in New Zealand. So I've run one so far, I have another one planned in a couple weeks. So who are the people that I'm specifically talking to? I group them into 3 groups. I'm looking at people who look at data standards, custodianship, and maintenance, and then I'm looking at the data collectors, creators, and sharers, and I'm looking at the users. And there's actually a lot of overlap between these groups. So I'm not going to break it down here because of time, but some examples of the users would be risk modelers, but they could also be data collectors because they might go out and conduct post-event damage surveys that would be used for their risk modeling. So they would be also creators and collectors. And then the sharers could be Land Information New Zealand, which is also a custodianship role that they, produce geospatial information and then share it with other organizations or share it on their open data portal. But they're custodians of that data as well. So there's a lot of overlap, which kind of made my job easy. 3 birds with 1 stone. I'm going to just walk you through some preliminary results that I have from one of my first round of interviews. And in this first round of interviews, I specifically focused on impact data and sources of that and how it can be used for impact-based forecasts and warnings. So first I asked, what were the data needs and the challenges with getting that data? So first of all, agencies really need to be able to trust the data. So the role of meteorological services in issuing warnings is to protect people and property. So they need to be perceived as trustworthy to stakeholders and the public. And so they need to be able to trust the data that they use to inform their decisions and their warning messages. This could be a problem for data sources like social media and crowdsourcing. It's not perceived as very trustworthy, so there's a lot of hesitation for them to turn to those data sources for impact information. Then we also need the systematic and standardized collection of the data. So many countries, including New Zealand, actually lack standardized and systematic collection of severe weather impact information. It's done by different groups at different levels. It's not very centralized, and they do it in their own way. There's not a lot of interoperability there, and it's hard to use them for any other purpose than what the data set was designed for. But if we can get systematic and standardized data collection happening, this could support evidence-based planning and decision-making and model comparison. And we need partnerships, data sharing and integration. So when I was talking to my participants, I found that many sources of impact data actually exist in many formats, as I said. And so we need these formal and informal partnerships, which may already exist, we just don't know about it, to share required information between agencies. And an example of kind of an informal partnership would be a telephone call from a hydrologist and a meteorologist from the New Zealand Met Service for them to say, heads up, this is what we're looking at. What do you think? Should we issue a warning, et cetera, et cetera? And they have these kinds of informal conversations, but they're really effective at sharing knowledge and information. But it is difficult, like I said, to integrate all these various formats of data in any meaningful way. And so I think that's a challenge that's beyond my PhD, but I'm trying to at least identify it and bring the attention to it. And then finally, data custodianship and cost. There's a big question mark of whose responsibility is it to collect and store all of this data, and how much is it going to cost, and how much money is actually available, how much funding is available. It's not in some agencies' remits to actually collect this data and take care of it. So for example, the Met Service in New Zealand, it's not in their remit to collect impact data. So whose job is it really? And again, that's a big question. That's more political beyond my PhD, but it's a fascinating question nonetheless. So some examples of existing and potential data sources that I identified from my interviews, specifically with regards to impact data. I found that there's kind of 2 groups of the data. There's official impact data and there's unofficial impact data. So crowdsourcing and citizen science and social media fall more under the unofficial impact data, and some agencies use it as monitoring the situation, verifying their warnings, sort of ad hoc on the fly. Some organizations actually specifically collect it and put it into their database. For example, in Europe, we have the European Weather Observer in Austria, MPing in the USA, and WeatherX in Australia. And they take those crowdsourced reports and verify it and put it in their database for further analysis. And then we also have 2 sort of timescales. We have real-time or near real-time, and post-event impact data. So the crowdsourcing and the citizen science and the social media, the real value in that data is its real-time or near real-time aspect of it. But again, like I said, the trustworthiness is, well, the perceived trustworthiness of it isn't so high. And then for post-event impact data, this is, the higher quality, more trusted data. So this includes impact assessments, media reports, and call center data, and then, existing event databases, some of which Isabel tapped into. And then we also have tacit knowledge and experience, like I said, hydrologists and meteorologists kind of calling each other up and saying, we've seen this happen before, so we should prepare, etc. So overall, for data uses, so far I've identified 2, but I'm sure there's many more. Uses of this data for impact-based forecasts and warnings specifically. So first of all, it's very useful for verification and validation of the warning or the model. So it can verify what happened on the ground using real impact information. And it can help meteorologists determine if they're under warning or over warning and strive for the right buoyancy of the warnings, as one of my participants said. And like I said, the real-time data is highly valuable for verifying and updating warnings on the fly. The other use is for actually defining thresholds for the warnings. So a lot of warnings traditionally are, the thresholds are based on the physical characteristics of the hazard. If we want to go to true impact warnings, we need to rethink and potentially redefine the thresholds so that they're more impact-based. So historical data could be used to prevent history from repeating itself, as another participant said, by allowing officials to identify trigger points, aka thresholds based on past events. So key findings are basically what I just said, but what I would like to highlight is that the limitations of this preliminary results is that I haven't covered vulnerability and exposure data, and those, like Isabel said, are really important considerations into impact-based forecasts and warnings. So that's the next steps of my PhD research. And so far I have, this is my conceptual knowledge base. I figured I should include it because that's what the title is. So it's this big framework of, first of all, on the left side is the data sources that I've identified, and I do have vulnerability and exposure data sources in there now, as well as hazard data sources. And then going into kind of what I've determined is the system box, but I'm probably going to rename that, and just basically how this data is all kind of funneled into either risk modeling or impact-oriented discussions, which are those more informal conversations, to then either define warning thresholds on the fly or define warning thresholds in advance, to then go in towards the decision-making for issuing an impact-based forecast or warning. So this is very much in development, and it will obviously change as I continue towards finishing my PhD. But the overall implications of my research is I have two sort of hopefully uses for my PhD. One is towards developing a national loss database for New Zealand, which is a priority under the Sunday framework, as well as furthering the efforts toward people-centered early warning systems, which I think impact-based warnings really fall under that. And then again, towards implementing impact-based forecasts and warnings in New Zealand. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. That was very informative. A lot of work to build this, and a lot more ahead of you, it seems still, but that's the nature of the beast. That's great. So you had a couple of comments or questions, and one's not directly related. Well, maybe it was related primarily to, I think, one of the graphics you showed about that private sector display of school bus closures or cancellations. And maybe it ties into the database in the sense of we don't always have to, I guess, build a giant database or have a plug and play type of impact model into that attaches to the numerical weather prediction that then gets vetted by the forecaster and put out into a warning process. In some cases, a good partnership with a group that's sensitive or vulnerable can bypass some of that or maybe should be a lesson that we can bring into a database format as a lesson learned or an experience that we can all share. So Steve Goodman suggested that, or commented that in the States, in Huntsville, Alabama, the National Weather Service is really closely linked to schools, and that when there's a forecast for early rush hour precipitation, that the schools proactively announce through different channels of media that schools will start 2 hours later. So they kind of reduce exposure over that early period. It seems to work, and it's kind of a success story, it seems. I'm wondering, how do we incorporate that kind of information into a shareable database, whether it's in a specific country or overall? Any comments?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's really good to know. I think really more at the local level or the county level. In New Zealand, we're going to go with the local level because we're so much smaller. But I think these relationships have really been developed between like civil defense and emergency management agencies and these interest groups or stakeholders like schools, hospitals, etc. And so I also heard of, for example, the hospitals here have been in touch with the Met Service to say we actually have an increase in asthma cases for thunderstorms, so we need to think about this. So I'm still working on like how to capture that in a database. It might just be a matter of just identifying these partnerships and saying they're here, and if we want this kind of information, this is who we can go to, and it's more in real time ad hoc. But yeah, it's a really good point.
That's great. Thanks for that question. Yeah. So one final question. James asked one, but he'll be presenting next, so we can build it into his talk. It's more of a comment. I think he'll be talking about it. So as a Grandstrom, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing names, I do like to say the names if I can, asks about, are there any issues regarding information security when you're collecting this data on vulnerability? So you can imagine there's an ethical aspect of this and all this work. Wonder if you could comment on that briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I didn't highlight in my big framework picture was a box that was kind of on this issue of what are the barriers to getting this information and using it. One of them is definitely privacy, security, and ethical issues of getting the data. So if we're going to use this data, we have to make sure that the right measures are in place to protect it, to remove personally identifiable information from it. And there are some agencies, at least in New Zealand, are working with very valuable mobile data, and they're actually associated with Statistics New Zealand. But before they share that data with anyone, they strip it of all the PII, and they have a team of lawyers that basically are working really closely with them to ensure that they're using the data ethically. So it's definitely something that we have to include in our plan. And when I was talking to now called the National Emergency Management Agency of New Zealand, at the time they were called something else. But when I was interviewing them, one of their concerns was the security of the data, and that even though they're, according to the Sendai framework, they should be just developing the national loss database. They don't have the security infrastructure in place to protect the data. So they're working with Stats New Zealand to kind of get that guidance. So yeah, it's definitely a very important consideration.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah, for your talk and for responding so well to the questions that were posed. And we're going to move on. So thank you so much. I can't imagine giving a talk at 3 or 4 a.m. So kudos to you. And I shared that on the chat, so the Q&A. So I think we all are in awe of your ability to, your resilience, I guess, to the clock. So I'm going to share again. Thanks. We'll go back to the overall agenda again, and our next speaker is James Daniel from